The Shep Naz podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shep Naz podcast. I'm Joe and I'm your host today. This past Sunday, Pastor Rob was sharing a message, Don't Stop Praying. And we were looking into the life of Daniel and how he has been consistent with prayer throughout his life. So today we're going to talk about that, maybe a little bit tomorrow also. Welcome in, Pastor Rob.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So you've been able to spend quite a bit of time kind of learning more about Daniel, maybe than you ever knew before. And this past week, you got to go on a little side trip and see some Daniel stuff.
Yeah. We went to the Sight and Sound Theater, did a live presentation that they simulcasted to theaters. And you and I, Monica, Susan, went to see that. It was really good. Very, very good.
It was pretty amazing. I would highly recommend. I know that they're going to make that available, probably digital download and also DVD. Daniel, and if you can still go out and see it, I think they said through the end of the year they're going to be continuing to do Daniel live at Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, they did like 250 performances so far, I think, when they interviewed a couple of actors.
All in 1 year, since March.
Crazy.
Pretty phenomenal.
Yeah.
But it was kind of neat to see some of that stuff, kind of live action, everything we've been talking about over the past few weeks.
Yeah, it was.
But what brings us to today's message? What's it more about?
Yeah, so today we're going to the famous chapter 6, which is the thing everybody knows Daniel for. I mean, obviously we know him, the book of Daniel about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, but today we're going to talk about the Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. And so it's it's a great story, and there's so many things to learn about that. Before we jump in there, I thought I would give a quick, we skipped chapter 5, and chapter 5 had a lot of information that was important. In between chapter 4 and chapter 6, what happens is Nebuchadnezzar passes away. In between Nebuchadnezzar, after Nebuchadnezzar passed away, there were some short-lived kings that didn't last very long. And then eventually his grandson, Belshazzar, becomes the king, and he wasn't a very good one. He partly because he ignored God and all the things that Nebuchadnezzar had taught him about God, because Nebuchadnezzar really had a change. You know, he transformed at the very end of his life, and he ruled for a while and ruled very well with the Lord. Taught these things, but his grandson didn't pay attention to it at all. And partly, I think it was because there was such a false sense of security that surrounded Babylon. I mean, it was such a massive kingdom, so many resources. I read somewhere that there were walls that surrounded parts of Babylon that were 300 feet tall. I mean, that's like a 30-story building. That's massive. I mean, especially in those days. But not surprising, because that's where the Tower of Babel was, back in Genesis. So. But anyway, in chapter 5, we find Nebuchadnezzar's grandson having a party. And as he's having this party, he, is probably had a little too much wine or alcoholic beverages. And he gets some of the items that had been stolen from the temple of God that Nebuchadnezzar took when they captured Jerusalem. And those items had kind of been stored away, and he got them out and used them in the party. So these are items that would have been used in worship in the temple, cups and bowls and that kind of stuff. And they filled it with alcohol or drinking with it, and basically taking the holy things of God and using them in a profane way. At the same time that's happening, that the Medo-Persian Empire, so Persia and Mede, M-E-A-D-E, they are gathering around the kingdom of Babylon to invade it. And the advisors are like, King, we got people around us, enemy armies all around us ready to invade us. And he's like, don't worry about it, we're fine. Well, what's really interesting is that while the walls were 300 feet high, what this army did was they rerouted the river that was flowing into Babylon they rerouted it, and the river dried up, and they walked under the walls, under the gates that they had created. And so you can build a 300-foot wall, but these guys walked under the wall. And so anyway, during this party, there's a hand that appears and writes a message on the wall. And you probably heard the phrase, the writings on the wall. Well, this is where that phrase came from. And the hand wrote a message on the wall, and no one really knew what it was. They didn't understand what it meant. So the advisors came in, which is typical in the book of Daniel. They couldn't figure it out. And so they're like, Daniel, can you tell us? And the message said, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, which was interesting. And what it basically meant was, your days are numbered. You're going to lose your kingdom. And you've been a bad king.
Right,
deal.
right.
And so he's like, don't worry about it. It's all going to be fine. Well, that very night, Belshazzar was slain. The Persians took over the kingdom, and a new king was named by the Persians, and he was a Mede, and his name was King Darius. And so King Darius is a Mede, but he's ruling for the Persian Empire on behalf of Persia, and he's now the king. And so Daniel has this role that he has had forever. And he's had it for, Nebuchadnezzar. He's had it for the kings that came after Nebuchadnezzar. He's had it for Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar. And now he has it for this new king whose name is Darius. And really what's interesting is that the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, remember in chapter 2, I think it was, that Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and he saw this statue, and it had a head of gold, and then a chest and arms of silver, and a stomach of bronze, and legs of iron, and then feet of iron and clay.
Yeah.
Well, this is exactly what was happening, because Nebuchadnezzar was the golden head. That was his kingdom. The next kingdom was literally the Persians and Mede kingdom, and we see that happening right now. Like, they just took over, they killed Belshazzar, and now Darius is the king. So that's what Daniel saw and what he interpreted in the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had is all coming true right in front of their eyes.
Yeah.
And at this point, Daniel is about 80, 85 years old, somewhere in that age category, which I think is interesting, because Moses was 80 years old when he started leading the people out of the promised land. So it doesn't matter how old you are, God can use you. If you're still breathing, he still wants to use you. But Daniel has found favor with Darius, and I don't know if his reputation preceded him or they had some conversations or whatever, but Darius has taken a liking to Daniel.
Right.
Which is wise, of course.
Yeah.
And so when Darius becomes king, then he appoints 120 leaders to rule throughout the kingdom. So again, Babylon is huge. So he's like, I need my leaders in now. And so he takes and puts 120 people all throughout the kingdom. And then over those 120 rulers, he sets 3 people, and Daniel was one of those 3 people. And so that's kind of where we pick up Daniel chapter 6. And it actually begins with Darius appointing these 120 leaders, and Daniel was one of the 3 that were over the 120. And that Daniel had distinguished himself among the administrators and satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So now the king is making plans to put Daniel over everything. So it'd be Darius, Daniel, and everybody else.
Yeah.
And what happens is these 120 rulers are like, they're mad about it. They're upset. It's like they're all in second grade, and how you were in second grade, something good happens to somebody else, you get mad about it and everything. And they were jealous and all this other stuff. So they're like, we got to figure out a way to trap Daniel. We got to figure out a way to make him look bad in front of the king, to get rid of him, because we don't want him to be our leader. And they look at his life, they think through everything, and they can't figure out anything. And what an incredible testimony to the life that he lived. They're like, there's nothing, he hasn't done anything that we can't trap him.
And they're willing to admit it. I mean, that's the beauty of it. Like, they're willing to admit that we're going after a guy that we can absolutely not find anything wrong with.
Yeah.
And so we're just going after him because he's filling a spot that we want to be in.
Yeah.
We just need to get him out of the way.
Yeah. And an interesting thing is, and I'm not comparing, Daniel to any modern day politicians, but we see that very same thing happening today. It's like, we want to, we don't want this person in power, so we got to go after them and we got to get them. And it's just an old playbook they're using, right? It's been around forever. So the one thing they say is that the only thing we can maybe trap him in is his religious life. Like that's maybe what we can do. So they come up with this plan and they go to Darius and they say, Darius, we've all gotten together and we think this is a really good idea, that we think you should put a decree out through the whole kingdom that says for 30 days, no one can pray to anyone except for you. Not like, no, they can't pray to anyone, only you. And everybody's on board, right? And so first of all, they lied because they weren't all together. Daniel wasn't on board, but Darius is like, is everybody together? And like, yeah, we're all on this. And so he's like, okay. So he makes this decree. Now, the other thing to know about this is that when you talk about a decree, that in the Eastern culture, when a king made a decree, it could not be changed. So he makes a decree, and there's nothing that he can do to change it. Like, he can't even go back and change it himself, which is why it seemed like he kind of went the extra mile to kind of like check and make sure, are you sure everybody's on board with this? Is this a good idea? Because once I say it, it's like it's written in stone. It's never going to change. So like, oh yeah, everybody's on. So he's like, okay. So he makes a decree, and then the decree was also that if anyone does something that they shouldn't be doing, they're going to throw them into the lion's den, right? Mm-hmm. So Daniel then hears this whole thing. He hears like what's happening, and he hears that this decree has been made. And I love what Daniel does. Daniel, when he learned that the decree had been published, it says in verse 10 of Daniel chapter 6, that he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed. So it's like, so the law goes out in the land, and the law is you can't pray to anybody except for Darius. If you do, you're going to get thrown into the den of lions. And what does Daniel do? He goes up to his room, opens the window toward Jerusalem, gets down on his knees, prays 3 times a day. And he started praying by giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. So it's even incredible that Daniel's thanking God for whatever circumstances he's facing. He wasn't like, God, this really stinks and I don't know what to do and everything. And he didn't think about it. He didn't call his buddies and say, what are you guys going to do? What do you think we should do?
Well, and I think one of the phrases you said in passing was really important, just as he always did. Like, this was not a protest. Like, this wasn't something where, well, if this is what the decree is, then I'm going to start behaving this way. Like, I'm going to go show them. I'll go home and I'll open my windows and I'll just pray just to show them that I'm not going to,
Right.
And this was just what he normally did.
He just kept on doing it.
And it's like, regardless of what the decree is, I know this is the right thing for me to do, so I'm going to keep on doing it. Yeah. So he wasn't doing it out of disrespect or to try to prove a point or anything like that. He was doing what he normally did.
Yeah, exactly. I think if there's a word that you could pick out to describe Daniel's life in chapters 1 through 6, the word would be consistent or continual. Like, he just kept doing what he always did. It was his strength. It was what gave him, the power that he had and the wisdom that he had. So he goes up to his room, starts praying, and then, the spies come around and they're like, we're going to follow him around. And they see Daniel in his room with the window open and he's praying. And so they're like the second graders that go back to Darius and say, hey, King, how's it going? And he's like, fine. And they're like, well, remember that decree that you made? And the king's like, yeah, I remember that. And they're like, you said that if anybody would be praying to anybody other than you for the next 30 days that you were going to throw them into the lion's den. And he's like, yep, that's what we said. And then they're all like, well, we just found somebody, and it's one of those guys that you've appointed over, given a lot of authority in your kingdom, and it's Daniel. And so, we're sorry, King. We know this really is sad for you, but you got to throw him in the lion's den.
We hate to be the one to tell you this.
Exactly. I mean, it's just like, oh my gosh, roll your eyes, stick your finger in your tongue and gag or whatever.
What's amazing to me though is that they were able to count on his spiritual consistency.
Yeah.
Like, and so much so that they could bank on the fact this will get him, because if we know anything about Daniel, we know that he is going to be spiritually consistent. Yeah. We know that in the face of a command to not do this, he's still going to do it. Yep. And like, unwittingly, they're admitting what a great witness Daniel has been to them. Yeah. Because they know exactly how he's going to behave.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. Yeah. Well, so when the king finds out, the Bible says that when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed because he liked Daniel. He cared about him. Daniel was a blessing to him or whatever. And the Bible even says that he was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort all the way until sun went down. to do it. So the king's trying to come up with anything in any way that he can think of to get Daniel out of this, because he doesn't want to throw Daniel to the lion's den, because it's a certain death kind of thing. You go down there where all these lions have never eaten, you're going to get eaten. And so he's tried and tries and tries. And in the midst of all of that, these guys, the Bible says, then the men went as a group to the king and said, "Remember, king, what you said. Remember your rules." And it's almost like you think of, these young, immature kids who go as a group, like, remember, let's all go together and support each other. I mean, it's just kind of like so childish, but this is what they did. And they remind the king, and they're like, "You said it, and this can't be rescued. You can't change the law." So they're like, "Yeah, you're right." And so king, to save his own face, gets Daniel, and they tie him up and they throw him in the lion's den. And the Bible says that when they throw him in the lion's den, so the den, typically back then, I did a little bit of research on this. A den of lions would have been a large, like a gigantic hole in the ground kind of deal, with a small opening where they could just throw food in to keep the lions alive. And then there was another way to get in that had a cage in it, that if you had to get them out, you could get them out. And the reason that there was a den of lions is because it was considered like a noble sport for a king to hunt lions. And so they would literally raise lions and breed them. And then when the king wanted to feel like a man, they would release a lion and he would chase it and kill it. And that was a noble sport. Kind of like in England, you'd have the fox hunts and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. That's why they had the lions. That's the reason that they were there. And then later on in the Roman Empire, they became, the king would also maybe, like, if he had somebody he wanted to dispose of, he would throw them to the lions. And that's how they would take care of, political dissenters, I suppose.
Sure.
But anyway, so they throw Daniel in, and the king is like really worried. He's like, "Oh, I feel bad about this." And the Bible says that they rolled a stone over the opening and they sealed it with the wax, with the king's signet ring, and the other 120 leaders. And so this is kind of interesting because it harkens forward to the stone that was rolled in front of the stone for Jesus, or in front of the grave for Jesus. And so what would happen is, the way that they would do is they would roll the stone over the opening, then they would pour wax around the edges between whatever, the opening. And then when the wax was still wet, the king had a ring with his monogram or signature on it or whatever, and he would stick his ring in the wax, and then it would dry. And it was symbolizing the fact that this is sealed with the authority of the king, and only the king is able to open it. And so the fact that all the other 120 advisors also did this, so there's like all these rings sealed in the wax, and it was so that there's just no way you could break that. And if you broke it, you were going against the rule of the king and those who were in authority, and you yourself would get in big trouble. So they sealed it, right? So it's sealed by the king, and the king goes back, and the Bible says that the king, couldn't sleep. He was hoping that Daniel was going to be okay, and he couldn't sleep all night. And then he wakes up very early in the morning, which is again indicative of that story the resurrection story, that they come early in the morning to see Jesus, and the stones rolled. So they get there, and the king yells from outside. He goes, "Daniel, has your God, the God who has the power to save, kept you from the lions, the den of lions," right? And Daniel said, he says, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king." And I think that's really interesting, that Daniel felt like the reason that the God sent an angel to keep the lions from eating him was that he was innocent in his sight. Like, he didn't do the things that they had accused him. He didn't do anything wrong. Mm-hmm. And I've not done anything wrong before any of the kings, whatever. And that God protected him that way. And the king, of course, the Bible says he was overjoyed. They took Daniel out of the lion's den. And then it says there was no wound found on him, because he trusted in his God. And then at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in, thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. So there was, and the Bible says, and before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So it wasn't like they were, not hungry when Daniel was in there, because when they took Daniel out, all, the people got thrown in there were crushed and overpowered immediately. But I don't know if this is like all the people that were conspiring against Daniel, but the Bible says there was 120 of them. And it was all of these guys that got together. So it could be that there was 120 men and all their wives and children that were thrown in there, and they were all immediately overpowered by the lions. And then one night that Daniel spent in there, he was totally fine. I mean, it was clearly God is saying, I'm displaying my power. I want you to know I'm in control, that I'm protecting Daniel and protecting his life. And then, of course, the king makes this great edict again, which is the pattern that we see. You know, someone takes a stand, God comes and delivers them, the king sees it, and then the king makes a decree about how great God is. And this is what he says. He says, may you prosper. He says, this says in verse 25, let me just read it. Then King Darius wrote to all the people, nations, and men of every language throughout the land, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom is not to be destroyed, will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And then again it says, so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And again, we see Daniel, who is just living this consistent life of faith in God and being obedient to him, prospers, grows in the midst of all this opposition and all these challenges that he faces. And as a result, then God gets the credit and God gets the glory. I mean, it's amazing. It's an amazing story. Yeah. And it's a story we tell our kids because it's got cool lions in it or something like that. but there's so many things to dive into, and maybe we can do that in the next episode, just dive into some of those things, because there's a lot.
There's definitely been some things that have been popping into my head, but we'll save those for tomorrow. Until then, you can double check. If you haven't seen the message from this past Sunday, you can go to shepnaz.org/media and go back and see the whole message. Also, be looking forward to tomorrow as we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this discussion.
It's going to be great.
It is. You can keep up with everything that's going on in the church by going to shepnaz.org. Also, we encourage you to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. For Pastor Rob, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.